I think, being a global guy, that we need to put another issue on the table, which is where global macroeconomic policies and the US role in terms of global macroeconomic imbalances may have made things worse. Adam's colleague Fred Bergsten has this very nice line about how the rest of the world gave the US rope to hang itself, but of course ultimately it was we in the US who hung ourselves, and that I think is a very apt analogy. But it does create this question about whether global imbalances were in fact very important. And if you think about where we are today in the debate, it's interesting to think about where the previous administration came out. And I'm not checking my email, but there is an important part of a statement put out by the White House in response to a New York Times story that I think is worth thinking about. It says the president highlighted a factor that economists agree on, that the most significant factor, emphasis mine, leading to the housing crisis was cheap money flowing into the US from the rest of the world, so that there was no natural restraint on flush lenders to push loans on Americans in risky ways. This flow of funds into the US was unprecedented, and because it was unprecedented, the conditions it created presented unprecedented questions for policymakers. In other words, it's all their fault. And this, I think, is a characterization, again, that needs to be dealt with. And I think this panel is actually very useful in terms of thinking about the US dimension of the crisis. But one can then step back and ask a couple of counterfactuals. We speak about regulation. We speak about global imbalances. What if we had better regulation? My view is that we've had better regulation. We may still have had certain problems in the market. I mean, ultimately, the capitalist system is subject to excesses, but pretty soon they tend to correct themselves. So with better regulation, we may have had excesses, but perhaps not as persistent ones. The global imbalances, I think, were very important in terms of thinking about how these excesses were allowed to build up over time. And ultimately here, we had this confluence of forces, using Senator Graham's words, that actually emerged on a global scale. You had instruments in the US that were not being regulated, and that had become much larger than the regulated part of the financial system. And you had the rest of the world willing to feed the maw of the US, essentially the financial development in the US, along with the fairly large budget deficits, allowed the US essentially to run policies that in a less globalized world may simply not have been feasible because the financing would not have been there.